This is Heather Wokusch, and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the case for media reform. Now, RFK Jr. one time said, Americans are the most entertained but the least informed people in the world. Now, is that true? And if it is, why? So today we are delighted to be able to talk to Mark Crispin Miller, who is a professor and media critic and professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. Mark Crispin Miller is the author of several books, including Boxed In, The Culture of TV, and also took part in the DVD called Orwell Rolls in His Grave, both of which we will show at the end of this segment. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Heather.
Yeah. Now, you have been interested in media and analyzing media for many, many years. Can you tell us why you got involved in that area?
Well, back in the 70s, when I was still a graduate student, I started writing articles about different aspects of the TV culture. I would do close readings of things like TV commercials. I did a piece on Family Feud, and they were a lot of fun. I would dig deep into these different texts and talk about what was going on in them. But as the years went by, I began to notice that there was something big happening. There was something behind all these little individual works that was more important than the works themselves. And then it became clearer and clearer that very few entities were taking control of the entire media landscape across the board, so that the media culture was becoming more and more monopolized by just a few huge players. So in the early to mid-90s, I began to focus on that phenomenon and try to... Media consolidation, exactly. And try to spread the word about it and about its destructive effects.
In the early 90s, I mean, that was way ahead of the curve, because a lot of people were not paying attention to it then. And now you've got basically 6 big companies that own and control so much.
That's right. I mean, it isn't like the old Hollywood system, which was itself monopolized by a handful of studios. We're talking about a handful of companies dominating everything: movies, TV, music, etc. That's unprecedented, and it has had disastrous effects for this culture and this democracy, if we can still call it a democracy.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting point, and that also leads to so many other avenues. For example, I'm thinking one is the geographical area. Another topic that we will discuss in another segment is the NYU's horrific expansion plan into Greenwich Village. Now, what is interesting for me is many of my friends in New York don't know about this, yet they know everything about the new, lineup for TV for the fall. And so we learn national news, but these really important local stories often we miss in this consolidation, which is, tragic, I would say.
I would argue with the claim that we know about what's going on nationally, because I don't think we know that either. It seems to me that as Americans who are sort of normally acculturated, right, take in X hours of TV a day and so on, we're basically floundering in an endless daily tidal wave of crap. It's just unremittingly shallow and ugly. I can't say enough bad things about it. But what's really worrying about it isn't so much the positive effects of what you're taking in. And by positive, I don't mean good. I mean the things you can notice that you are receiving. What's really troubling is all that you're not getting. Right? All the information, the vital news and so on that you're not getting. And that's most worrisome about the quality of media in America today. I think we have one of the worst media systems in the world. We certainly have one of the worst news systems in the world. And I think it's a system that's spreading globally, which is particularly worrying.
Yeah, and that's the other area of the geographical thing that I think is interesting. For me, for example, I have lived in a lot of different countries, and currently I'm based in Europe. And what's interesting is many of their TV channels used to be public, and they got a lot of money, and so they showed these intelligent shows. Possibly not the most interesting, but they're intelligent. But now, through deregulation, you have a lot of these private channels coming up who are taking all of this American tidal wave of crap, as you said, and making money, commercially. But it means it's basically spreading this, it's like metastasizing a cancer all across the world. And so, for example, in Austria, it's interesting. Kim Kardashian is recognized there. Why? Why is she recognized here? But she's also recognized there, and so it's essentially dumbing down the whole world with our media system. Now, it's quite an export. Hollywood or certain people are making a lot of money from it, but it's, again, we don't learn about our local news either here, and it's also cutting the local news that people learn about in other countries.
Well, that's right. What we're really talking about here is the neoliberal order, right? As it pushes deregulation on more and more spheres of life. It invariably degrades the quality of news and entertainment too, generally speaking. Now, I'm sure many people listening to us talk will immediately say to themselves, what an elitist conversation this is. These are people who basically don't like the kind of stuff that average people like, and I would quarrel with that inference. That's really not the case at all. I mean, when you basically dominate a media culture, when a few huge players dominate that culture, they're looking to appeal to the largest possible number, and consciously working to appeal to the lowest common denominator, or to use the lowest common denominator, right?
Yeah.
We're actually not really, no population is just one big, huge mass of people. Every population is actually comprised of a lot of different audiences. There are many audiences within the United States. There are many audiences within each other country we talk about. And each of those audiences really deserves its own, tolerable media fare. But when you're working for a Disney or Time Warner or whichever of the giants, we're talking about News Corporation, you're only interested in getting the quickest possible return by appealing to the largest possible number. So what tends to happen is that movies, for example, or TV shows will, for years on end, be pitched towards males between 18 and 34, okay? Well, first of all, not all males within 18 and 34 will necessarily like the stuff you're pitching at them, which is frequently based on what sold a year ago, right? Second of all, there are a whole lot of people who don't fall into that demographic group, you see? So it would actually be healthier for everyone if we had a media culture that was more diverse, that had more participants, that had more players, that had more creators, that had more interests represented. And then there'd be all kinds of stuff to choose, for many, many different demographic groups. I hate to use that expression, demographic groups, because it's market speak, and I prefer to think in more old-fashioned terms of a citizenry. I know that's hopelessly quaint and so on, but nevertheless, that's kind of what we're talking about here. We have a media system that does not approach us or treat us as citizens. It approaches us as consumers, right? As if our whole function in life is simply to gobble things up. All we are in the eyes of this system is a source of revenue, and that's an inhuman kind of calculus.
I couldn't agree more, and I think another factor to that is that many of the people who are on the board of these media companies are also on the board of many of these consumer companies, retail companies, or the defense industry, and so that also indicates the kind of programming that we get and the kind of news that we do not get, this cross, sectioning of society. And so that's another problem.
Well, it is. I guess we could talk more specifically about the news, because in a way that's the heart of the matter. You cannot have a functioning democracy in which people are uninformed. And you quoted RFK Jr. at the beginning about this. People can be entertained but not informed. I mean, you can be informed through entertainment, you know. It is possible to have great entertainments that also actually sort of expand your consciousness and teach you things about your own national past and so on.
Okay.
I mean, there were a lot of great movies that came out in the 70s in the United States that are entertaining even now, and that actually shed a fascinating and important critical light on American culture and history, like the Godfather films, for example, or Chinatown, movies like that.
Okay.
So, you know, it's probably incorrect to separate education from information in too radical a way, you know. But the fact is that the news is the heart of the matter. And if the framers of the Constitution, the citizens of the early republic, were to be transported forward in time and look at the news system that we have today, they'd kill themselves. You know what I mean? They'd say, forget it, let's not even bother with it, it's not going to work. They'd be shocked. I mean, their notion of the free press and ours were radically different. For one thing, the press, in the eyes of the framers and others, was not a separate industry from the rest of the population. You know, now you have to get press credentials. You have to go to a J school, right? And then you end up taking a job with something like News Corporation or the New York Times, huge corporate entities, the likes of which simply didn't exist in the 18th century. They weren't around. The press back then was much smaller scale. It was more grassroots. If you had the capital to get yourself a printing press, right, you basically were in business. And the press was understood back then to be a crucial means of political information and education for the American public. You know, not slaves, obviously. There were flaws in that system, clearly, from an ideally democratic point of view. Nevertheless, those who were participating in the system were able to get their hands on a broad range of newspapers, and often were able to read newspapers in their own states that included content from newspapers in other states. Well, this was all because of government policy, see? People today probably assume they may credit this sort of Tea Party fantasy that the press in the United States started out as this great free market creation. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. James Madison and others understood that you could not have a viable press in this, infant republic unless government policy favored it. And that's why the Post Office Act of 1792 is so important. The Post Office was created primarily, some might even argue exclusively, to facilitate the circulation of political information, which is really amazing when you look at the post office now. I mean, you look at the kind of junk mail you get in your mailbox and so on, right? That's what it was for. And it was understood that newspapers would be viable, would be economically viable, if there were bulk rate. You know, if it were possible to mail newspapers, circulate them cheaply. That's why they set up the post office, and they were explicit on this subject.
Okay,
you see?
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the creation of a system of postal roads was based on the understanding that it has to be easy to, get from one state to another, right, in order to circulate the newspapers so that the press could circulate. This is extremely important,
It could be argued that digital media and blogs such as your, News from Underground is the modern day equivalent of that, because then you can share information. It can cross borders, even national borders. It doesn't cost much, and you can kind of get away from this huge commercialization center. But it's not easy, because then people do this and they don't get money and they take their own time, but it is a form of democracy.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. I've often said that the blogosphere, which is much derided by establishment journalists, is the closest equivalent we have to the press system of the 18th century. It's absolutely true. Certainly there's a lot of garbage online. There are a lot of terrible blogs, and there's a lot of lunatic propaganda and genuine conspiracy theory. We'll talk about conspiracy theory in a moment. But despite that, I mean, that's what you get when you have a democratic system. You get all kinds of stuff. But you do have an absolutely crucial sphere in which it's possible to argue with or contradict or disprove the material that you're getting, pumped into your mind day after day by a corporate press that is, for all intents and purposes, just like a state-controlled press, even though it's technically not state-controlled.
Definitely. And another element of conspiracy theories you mentioned before, I read a statistic that those who look at commercial news are actually 3 times more likely to be misinformed than those who get, their media from, for example, NPR or whatever. And so when you look at conspiracy theories, then actually one could argue that a lot of the commercial press, such as Fox, that's where the conspiracy theories often come from,
Well, a certain kind of conspiracy theory comes from the right-wing press. And it, by and large, tends not to be ridiculed and dismissed by the mainstream.
Right, that's the point.
Occasionally it is. I mean, Glenn Beck, for example, in his glory days, would go completely hog wild with some conspiracy theory. And in that case, mainstream journalists would call him on it and call what he was saying conspiracy theory.
Sometimes. But sometimes, him and his little graphs and God
right, they would
what,
let it go for the most part.
Yeah.
And there are official conspiracy theories. I mean, a lot of the Islamophobia that's kind of raging throughout the country at the grassroots level is fed really by, mainstream ideology. It's very similar to anti-communist conspiracism of the 50s into the 60s, which was really fed by the mainstream, right? It would sometimes go too far, as in the case of what we call McCarthyism, right? But it was fed by the establishment, okay? But what interests me is the tendency people now have, and that the press certainly has, to immediately dismiss a broad range of stories, really kind of important scandals, as conspiracy theory in a way that makes it impossible to grapple with genuine problems that pose a real threat to our national survival and a threat to our democratic freedoms. This is a fairly recent phenomenon, but it's one that we all now take for granted.
I think that's very important, and possibly one part of that is the fact that many of the people who are on these huge boards, are way up, who are controlling what the information that we get. They don't want to have these issues discussed, for example. Possibly, they will harm, if we really get down and talk about the weapons industries, then that's going to impact some of the shareholders that they have in other companies, and they don't want that. And so it'd be better, to be pro-military or something like that.
Well, that's certainly true. Let me make a distinction. There are a lot of stories that would, as you say, threaten corporate interests, okay? And so the corporate media, understandably enough, steers clear of those stories. This is not new. I mean, for as long as the American press has been driven by commercial advertising, which really started in the 1880s, for all that time, our media has steered clear of any stories that will hurt advertisers' interests. I mean, it was primarily the most notorious example in those days was patent medicine advertising. Patent medicine, which was essentially poison, made millions of dollars, and these people were heavy advertisers. And it was kind of a scandal that the press was not actually telling the truth about what was in these medicines. And that kind of came to a head in the early 20th century. And then all these magazines and newspapers very piously swore off of patent medicine advertising. But that left all kinds of other big, more legitimate industries sort of in control. The best known example is the tobacco industry, right? For decades, there was no news whatsoever about the discoveries doctors and medical researchers were making about the health effects of smoking, right? And it was because the tobacco companies were huge advertisers for decades and decades. All right, and that continues today. It hasn't changed. I mean, obviously, if your bread and butter comes from a powerful advertiser, you're not going to publish news that's going to piss that advertiser off, or that advertiser will pull his advertising.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And then when you get in bed with, politicians as well, then we shouldn't talk about, for example, yesterday was the anniversary of 911, and then there's some certain, topics that also we shouldn't talk about. So it's not only the commercial aspect, but a little bit of political things too that we shouldn't talk about. For me, what's interesting in terms of coming back to the United States after a while, every time I come back, is the main thing is the emphasis on younger and younger and younger people. Now it's Honey Boo Boo and her dysfunctional family, and so it's this kind of soft porn element to everything. It's sensationalism, I guess, is what I want to say. No fact-checking in the media, but also in the stories, it's just sensationalism. And it just seems to be heading down a very slippery and dangerous slope, I guess. Where do you see this trend, this overall trend in the media going?
Well, it's not going anywhere good. I mean, that's the reason why we need a serious media reform movement. This is not something that's happened. It's not like a kind of elm tree blight or some natural calamity like that.
Right.
It's not that. It's the direct result of a certain kind of government policy on media, and ours is, again, to return to a point we discussed earlier, driven by a neoliberal agenda. Right, that we privatize, we deregulate, we basically let a few huge players dominate the media market, and this is something that works to the detriment of the whole civic culture and the culture more generally speaking.
So what would be your desire for media reform if there were 5 points that you want to see implemented? What would you say?
Wow. Well, for one thing, we would place strict limits on the number of stations that a single company can own.
Okay.
It used to be limited. I think in the days of radio, it was just 5, I think, stations that one big company like NBC or CBS
and
could
then you
own.
have Clear Channel with 1,000.
Well, there's no limit on the number of stations that a company can own. So you have Clear Channel, which owns, I don't know, by now over 12 or 1,400 stations nationwide. Yeah. The biggest owner of TV stations in this country is the News Corporation. It's Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah, exactly.
Who got permission to enter into our market by getting a waiver from the FCC, because News Corporation is actually a foreign company. It's Australian.
Yeah.
So we basically have to re-regulate the media system.
Okay.
And return to something like the code that was part of the 1934 Communications Act.
Okay.
But I also think we have to really take a very hard look at the assumption that commercial media is somehow superior to public media. That's a disastrous assumption, and it's proven to be calamitous, especially now that these powerful business interests really no longer regard magazines and newspapers and news generally as worth sponsoring. You pick up the New York Times or any newspaper now, and it's very, very thin. There's very little in it.
Yeah, except for advertisements.
Well, and not that many. That's the point. Not that many advertisements.
Yeah.
The news shows on TV, are having trouble finding advertising. Now, for a long time, people assumed that there was a natural fit between democracy and capitalism in a particular way. That is to say, that advertising would always serve to bolster the news system. It would keep it going. Therefore, it performed a very important civic function. Well, it's no longer the case that advertisers are flocking to support news organizations, so news organizations can no longer depend on that kind of subsidy. This is a very interesting and exciting time in one sense, in that people are now beginning to discuss alternative ways of funding news organizations, and there's a whole range of alternatives that we could discuss. But that's a kind of conversation we have to have. Certainly, while we talk about re-regulating at least broadcast news environment in a way that will help us become better informed citizens, we also have to talk about subsidizing public media in a really thorough and generous way. I mean, we have NPR now, basically.
And
PBS.
you and I now are at the Manhattan Neighborhood Network, public access, and so,
right.
And we probably couldn't be talking about these things on the mainstream media.
I can tell you for sure we wouldn't be allowed to, because I've tried many times.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
But you see, NPR is in a way part of the problem, because first of all, it's national and not local, okay? So that often in local markets, you'll be getting Diane Rehm, you'll be getting the national shows. You won't, every region, every city really richly deserves its own well-funded public media system. So you could talk about issues like this.
Like NYU and,
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, so have companies be able to own fewer outlets. Okay.
Right. And a much more generous subsidy for public media, both national and local. Right.
And is there anything else that you can think of, just in closing, any other things on your wish list?
We're finished already, are we? Well, I mean, in order to own a broadcast license, a TV station or a radio station really has to adhere to a strict code of public service, which has been thrown out over the decades, and we have to return to something like that.
Yeah, it's that distinction between entertainment and information and what is in the public service, and how do you define that? That's a very interesting question, and I can say I've never, in all of the different countries that I've lived in, I haven't seen that really, addressed and dealt with. So my last question, based on all of this, are you optimistic, for, say, the next 10 years? Pessimistic? What would you say?
Well, my feelings are mixed, okay? I think it's a mixed picture. But I do think that there are enough people who get it, and that the crisis we're facing, political, economic, environmental, and so on, is so serious that it will push people to start thinking in a more receptive way about the need for a genuinely revolutionary kind of solution to these problems, you see. So I guess I'd say I'm guardedly optimistic.
Okay, perfect. And so what I would like to also invite everybody is to be more optimistic, or to learn more about this, to view your blog, which is News from Underground, and it's at markcrispinmiller.com, and you can read that on the credits later. We want to thank you so much for having joined us today. That was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
And we look forward to talking to you again.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.